Welcome to Warrior Money, the show devoted to supporting our brother and sister veterans. I'm Patrick Murphy.
And I'm Dan Kunze.
No guests this week, so it's just us two digging into something big. President Trump's $1 trillion defense budget. We're going to break it down, what it means, where all the money goes, and how it could impact our brother and sister veterans, service members, and the country as a whole. So let's get after it. All right, Dan, top of the line, first ever $1 trillion DOD budget. Thoughts?
It's a big number. It's a big number. There's a significantly a psychological barrier hurdle that you go over when you go from the B's to the T's, and that's what we're doing here. I think what's also really interesting about it when you start to dig into the details of it is it appropriates new dollars for a program like Golden Dome. It shifts focus and priority from Europe and the Middle East to Indo-PACOM, and it starts to reorient the way that we're managing some of our former existing platforms and legacy systems into new systems and new autonomous systems, which actually comes from the work that we learned in UCOM and Ukraine over the past couple of years. So pretty fascinating numbers that are thrown around.
Yeah, and especially when you pass the House, the Senate's going to mark it up, send it back. But, as we're going through this, as a former appropriator, we're going to go through this. It cuts domestic spending about 10% at least, but it increases, obviously, defense spending at 10%. And so when you look at the overall picture, though, roughly $7 billion in spending, we only have about $7 trillion in spending, $5 trillion in revenues coming in, still some deficits there. Does that give you pause?
The way that we're organizing this generally concerns me from the perspective of what do I think the greatest national security threat is? I think it's actually our national debt and it's our political infrastructure at home. That's the issue that I'm most concerned about, which is also the issue that the markets are very concerned about, kind of those things. As a person that also believes in strong defense and very strong national security, I'm happy to see that we're reorienting the money that we are and we're okay with it. So I think the devil or the goodness is in the details, like they say, but I'm most concerned about our disproportionate amount of spend versus save. It's just it's an issue we have to deal with.
Admiral Mullen, the former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, said in the Obama years, the greatest threat, national security threat, is actually our national debt. And at that point, the debt was about $13 trillion. It's now 3 times as much. It's now $36 trillion. The bill that passed at least the House, we'll see, adds another $4.5 trillion. And when you look at that, and we're spending $900 billion a year just on the interest rate of our national debt, it is concerning. But you and I are both veterans. We understand national security is critically important. But at the same time, you're passing, a $1 trillion defense budget and the tax breaks, most of which goes to the wealthiest among us. It definitely gives me heartburn as a fiscal conservative.
Yeah, it gives me some heartburn too. But I think the really interesting conversation you and I have, and I think we're having with our audience, is when you invest money in the defense industrial base or the national security apparatus, you're not just investing money. And I view kind of the $1 trillion spending bill as an investment in national security, but also as an investment in the underlying technologies. You're also creating a new environment for companies to leverage the opportunity to be commercial, both in DoD, but also have a commercial applicability. So I think about supply chain technologies. I think about the advent of GPS. I think about next generation GPS. I think about all the different things that are going to come about because you've invested this money here. They're going to reap the benefits. So I don't view it necessarily just as a spending bill. I view it as an opportunity to make wise investments, and that's how I view the difference.
Yeah, and I think that's one thing I got excited about, the recalibration when you talk about autonomous vehicles, you talk about AI.
Yeah.
So let's expand on that. I do think that they are refocusing efforts on that, and not the fights from basically the past, the fights of the future. And we learned this after World War II. We had the greatest generation. We stepped up. We helped win World War II with our allies, but then we had the Korean War. It was Task Force Smith, where we were woefully unprepared for the fight against North Korea, and again, China at the time too, because they were supporting them. But, when you look at the next fight, do you think this budget does do some recalibration that is much needed?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. I think about this thing. I think about these things through the lens of every generation or every great generation has its own differentiating capability, right? So the Civil War was won by the rifle and a bunch of other logistics capabilities. You go to World War II, it's our ability to increase mass production and be able to facilitate through our capital markets and our financing, right? And now we're starting to get to this other age where it's artificial intelligence and space are going to be two differentiating technologies and domains that we're going to have to deal with, right? We aren't going to have the quantity of people that's sufficient to support our work in Indo-PACOM, and space is becoming the new most contested domain, right? So between AI and space, you've got to make investments to stay at the forefront of that domain capability, that domain area. And I think that that's what this is doing. So I'm very encouraged to see that.
Yeah, yeah. And then when you're thinking about those domains, it's like, obviously it's clearly from history, obviously land and then air, sea. But when we talk about space and cyber, critically important, one of those major components of the defense budget that at least was passed in the House is the Golden Dome.
Yeah.
Walk us through what that is from your point of view.
I think Golden Dome is like this all-encompassing concept that's going to be defined over time, right? There's three sections of it. There's a space-oriented section of it. There's a ground-based oriented section of it. And there's also like this software layer integration that's a part of it as well. So space sensors, ground sensors, and then this like all-encompassing capability, right? And so we've heard a lot in the news about tariffs. We've heard a lot in the news about other countries, but the interesting thing about this is it's a North American defense system, or at least we're going to have to rely on our neighbors to the north in Canada to be able to support some of the sensor network as well. So what I think is really interesting, though, is that it's and we talked about enterprise software and enterprise capability on our last call. Like, it's one of those things that you have the opportunity to leapfrog capabilities in, which is a really interesting concept, right? You can take 20 or 30 disparate systems and bubble that up to one large system. The point of failure, the concern point is, if you have one too big to fail program, what happens if it either goes over budget or over time or has different concepts? That's something they're going to have to navigate through from a real strong program and project management perspective.
Yeah. And when you look at the sheer numbers of the $25 billion over 20 years, the CBO scored at about $500 million investment.
$500 billion.
$500 billion investment, which is a lot of money. But, a lot of folks, this is what I don't like about politics. People, because it's a Republican idea, some Democrats are automatically against it.
It's a long time idea, though. This was 30 years.
Yeah, 1983. We had Star Wars, or what they called Star Wars, on this. But now we have the technology 4 decades later to talk about what you're saying when you talk about land-based sensors, space-based sensors, which is really the domain that's really contested right now, and then the software underpinnings to connect them all together. Because right now, if you have missiles from China and coming in, China, Russia, and they come in, we are really only protected on California and Alaska, which is why we need partners like Canada and others to protect maybe our East Coast, et cetera.
It turns into a really bad day really fast because the you and I know and everybody, all our audience knows from the defense side, right? Like defense in depth, and then the proximity with where you're at. Like, standoffs are a really important thing, right? If I can't see something that's happening, or I don't know where it's coming from, how do you think about defending against that? And then, more importantly, how do you protect your supply chain, your logistics lines? How do you protect your people? How do you protect your installations? How do you do all those things if you can't see it in the first place? That's where I think the advance of quantum computing, artificial intelligence, and sensors is really going to come together to consolidate that, which I think for our audience is super important, because when we're thinking about where we're going to invest for the next 10 years or the next 20 years, or how we're going to invest in our service members, it has to be oriented to where the puck's going and not where it's been.
Yeah, the great Wayne Gretzky coach. We're both hockey players, where we talk about
hockey players dropping a little hockey on us.
Yeah. And the quote is, someone asked Wayne Gretzky once, how'd you score so many goals, get so many assists? He said, I don't pass the puck where people are going to be. I'm going to pass the puck where they're going to be. And when you look at things like the kill chain, et cetera, what we need to do to make sure that our warfighters do not have, basically, they have everything they need to have the technical and tactical advantage over enemies.
Memorial Day was recently, and it's like one of those concepts. My grandpapa used to get in my ear about this. He was like one of the things that broke his heart about Vietnam is that they went to the war with some of the equipment from the past war. Like, it was not the right equipment at the right time. We saw the same thing in Iraq. We went to war with not necessarily the right things, and then we rekitted ourselves over time. You give American industry the ability to learn from it, they're going to do it. One of the questions I have for you, though, I think our audience would be interested in as well. What is a markup? Like, what does it mean to go through an appropriations process and mark up a budget, and what does that mean?
Yeah, so there's over a dozen committees in Congress, and then have the committees that are, most of them are authorizing committees. Like, I was on Armed Services, I was also on Intelligence. They are authorizing committees. But then, after I got a little seniority, I was in the appropriations. They actually have to appropriate it. And so when you bring it back on markup, it is the markup of what's going to make it to the budget or not make it up, make it in there. And that's critically important. And a lot of times these markups are a dozen hour longs. They're 3, 4 o'clock in the morning, and it's basically like a clerical road march. But it is incredibly important because, as you mentioned, we're not talking about millions of dollars that a lot of these times. You're talking about billions, tens of billions, and even trillions of dollars that we're spending to make sure our warfighters do not have a fair fight, that they have the technical and tactical advantage over our enemies.
Your good friend, I think your roommate somewhere in the Army, was Secretary McCarthy. And he was pretty famous for having night court, I think is what he called it, where they went through the budget and they figured out where in the Army they could reprogram dollars to make those sorts of influences. Is that what we're talking about? Or are we talking about something a little bit different?
Yeah, it's a little different. Markup is really in the Congress, but night court, and again, I applaud former Army Secretary Ryan McCarthy. We were bunkmates at Fort Bragg in the 90s. He was a great graduate of VMI. I know he's a fan, and he did great work because what he was saying is, I'm going to focus like a bulldog on a bone and making sure we're getting our return on investment on the billions of dollars we're spending. You got to remember, the Army budget, yes, we have 1.3 million people in the Army, 1 million soldiers, 300,000 civilians, but it's like $180 billion bills, budgets that you have to deploy on behalf of our nation, and you got to be spending it the right way. He made sure we were getting after it. We're reestablishing it now, and I think it's a very good thing.
Awesome. Well, hold that thought. We'll be right back after the break. All right, welcome back to Warrior Money. Let's pick up where we left off. We were just talking about Secretary Ryan McCarthy, who was Secretary of the Army under the first Trump administration, and we were talking about how he held night court, right? He also instituted some of these policies that created the infrastructure for artificial intelligence in the Army. He created this organization called the Army Cloud Management Office, which then became ECMA, which a dear friend of ours, Paul Puckett, ran as well. But my question for you is, when we think in presidential terms and we think about one budget and yearly budgets, right? That was nearly 8 years ago that he did that. Help our audience understand, like, why does it take so long to make those changes within the organizations that we're talking about?
Well, it's like, listen, our Army, as even the Army song is, the Army goes marching along. We are a bureaucracy, we're big, but we have to be agile. We have to be cutting edge. And what I think they've done and what a lot of folks have tried to do is keep that focus where it needs to be and not just throw money at problems, making sure that we're getting our return on investment. And that's why when you had night court, when I used to be at we call it a CAPE, the CAPE office every 6:30 a.m. every Thursday morning, we'd be there. I'd be there with the controller, the other undersecretaries, the chief management officers of the services. And we get there and we go line by line on, okay, what's going on? What do we need to do? Where's the Congress at? And you have to recalibrate to make sure we're spending the money the appropriate way. And a lot of folks just want to spend it. They don't want to look at it. They just want to just get out the door. And that's not having fidelity to the American people and the American taxpayer.
Yeah, sometimes I refer to that as you got to dig the hole concept, right? Sometimes you've got to dig a new hole to create a new foundation. Like we've had the privilege of working with Justin Finelli from the CTO from the Navy. We worked with Paul. We worked with
Gabe Samarello. Yeah, Gabe Samarello, the Undersecretary of the Army. Yeah.
And these things that are good ideas take persistent time to make work, right? So the administration might be here, but the work and the policies have to continue to exist below that.
Yeah, and that's why I think, like, when you see, like, I know I got in there when I was the acting Secretary of the Army, which is amazing, by the way. They have my bunkmate, kind of follow my.
Yeah, it's a small
and
army.
He's a great American, and we're two different political parties, but that doesn't matter. We are part of the warrior class, like we all are. But I think when I went in there, I did this audit of Army marketing, right? Because I left Congress. Worked for NBC, understood some budgets because of my political campaigns, et cetera, spending $15 million in the Philadelphia mini market. And then I was like, hey, if we're recruiting 120,000 millennials, Gen Xers and now Gen Zers a year, why aren't we doing more in the digital spend? And I was asking the tough, probing questions. I said, we got to audit this because I'm not getting the right answers from folks. And then we hit recruitment goals. And part of that is because you got to meet people where they are. And, when you have a Fortune 2 size entity like the U.S. Army, and we had not hit recruitment goals. We hit it those 2 years. They were struggling, and I think we're seeing a new refocus on that. It's getting these great young Americans at a time when only 24% of young Americans can even join our military.
Yeah.
Because we have less high school graduates because of the obesity and overweight, crisis in America, where 70% of us.
The New York Times or Wall Street Journal article specifically also said that 78 or 79% of the people that serve come from the same communities.
Yeah.
So it's the same communities and it's a smaller amount of people. And it's really hard to walk that fine balance if you're not getting to where they are, if you're not talking to them early enough, which is also the transition problem, but it's for a different conversation. But it's like, that's this whole issue about, what I thought was a really compelling article or ad from the Secretary Hegseth and President Trump most recently. It was a pretty compelling ad about like, hey, military is here to fight, win battles. And if we're going to take people out of their prime, we should make it worth their while, make it worth their time to do.
Yeah. And I think that's the great thing about War Your Money, Dan. And what we try to tell, the patriots that listen to the show is the fact that like, we give credit where credit's due.
Yeah, totally.
When you have President Trump and Pete Hegseth sitting there, and I wrote down some notes on it, peace through strength. Like, America at her best is a reluctant warrior. America at her best is Athens and Sparta. And that those of us who have seen combat, we don't want our sons and daughters to fight wars. And he also said one other thing, and it was Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth, who, as you know, I worked with at Fox, who said this great line in that commercial you mentioned. He said, we fight not because we have hate in our hearts of the folks who are in front of us. It's because of the love we have the folks that are behind us. Those 340 million Americans, that understand that in our country that is so diverse, that even our forefathers who said in our Constitution and preamble, in order to form a more perfect union, we weren't perfect then, we're not perfect now. But if we could just focus on coming together sometimes on certain things, and especially around our warfighters, that's what people want to see.
Yeah, and you asked me a lot earlier in this conversation about how I feel about spending the money. I have a really hard time looking at the cost of Afghanistan and Iraq and not thinking that if somehow we can prevent that expense, it's a better overall expense than not having to start in the first place, right? Or being so overwhelmingly powerful that you don't have all the issues that you're going to have elsewhere. So I think in my heart, it's hard to sometimes blend like the $1 trillion expense plus the opportunity cost, I guess is the right way to say if you're thinking about business terms, but like the opportunity cost of $1 trillion versus deterrence, right? How do you quantify deterrence? How do you do that? It's sometimes it's difficult to do, but I very strongly believe that.
Yeah, and I think the beauty of it, it's like, we just had Memorial Day a little bit ago, and it's like I wrote a Substack. It was called "It's Time to Take a Sacred Pause." And budget seasons are a time because budgets are moral documents. The budgets that Congress passed, because they have the power of the purse, they work in conjunction with the president and executive branch, but it goes through them. Take a pause. Are we investing the American taxpayer dollars the right way? And yes, I think we have to have and continue to have the number one military in the world, because there are folks that do want to do harm to our families.
Absolutely,
there are folks that want to do harm because
authoritarians are
right.
They deserve it.
So we got to keep that. And yes, we got to keep, cut some domestic spending and make sure we're getting our bang for a buck there. But you have to do it in an ethical way and in a responsible way. And you can't be doing it by, adding to our debt year after year and say, oh, well, our kids will pay for it. Like, that's immoral. I mean, it's immoral that, Maggie Murphy, Jack Murphy, and your 3 kids are going to have to spend and pay off the debt that we're racking up now, and just on the interest of the debt we're racking up now. And a lot, frankly, that goes to the wealthiest among us.
I mean, you and I can say whatever we want about our opinion about that, but the most recent yield is also Treasury yield is telling a pretty significant story about how it feels about that over time. And that's really a pretty compelling conversation.
Yeah, and we'll talk about Moody's downgrading us and the yield. And I would say also, the first 3 months, was a net loss. If you have another net loss the next 3 months, that means we're officially in a recession. And nobody wants that. Like, we cheer for America. We love our country more than political parties. But we have to do it the right way. You have to get these tariffs right. We got to get the economy moving. Our business leaders want certainty. And the beauty of our nation and our country is that we have the number one military in the world and the number one economy in the world. But that's not our God-given right. We got to earn it every single day.
You and I have, so I think we have an agreement about this pretty strongly. Like, I want certainty with my business community, but I also don't think that we should have offshored jobs and industry the same way that we did over the past 50 years, right? Like, so I understand from a business perspective why that's great, right? But I really want to see semiconductor industry come back to the United States. In fact, in a couple of weeks, I'm going with business executives for national security Benz to a semiconductor plant in Albany, and I want to see more of these things. So when NVIDIA commits to reshoring dollars and creating dollars back here, that's a net benefit win for all of us, whether it's national security or commercial or the financial markets. Like, that's a good thing for us. I really think, though, that if the tariffs were used as a forcing function to reshore jobs back again, and there was a small term pain on that, that makes a bit of sense to me. I think, though, that we need to be consistent in the way we're applying our principles and our ideas there, and that's what I think is too left to be seen. From your point on certainty.
Yeah, no doubt. And that's my thing is, just do it where, like we learned in the military, we call it ready, aim, fire, not fire, aim, ready.
Yeah, and you don't have to tell us you're doing it. Like, I don't need to get up the surprise part of it, but it's just like over time, the pattern recognition is like, I just need to see what the pattern is so that we can make good investments as it relates to how we operate our business or where we're operating our business from. Like, that's really what we're trying to do, is like return our capital, make sure we're making those good decisions. I didn't really want to be holding the bag with a factory I just put together in China. If you're saying that we now have to reshore everything else, that's an issue.
Right, and especially when we had the crisis years ago with infrastructure during COVID.
Yeah, totally.
On the semiconductors, you mentioned that because the majority of them are made in Taiwan. Well, what happens if China invades Taiwan? Yeah. That's why we got to bring this stuff onshore, creating these manufacturing jobs, making that high-end technology here that we could, obviously, Taiwan will still be our partner and our friend, but we got to make sure we're doing it the right way.
Yeah, one of the great articles you had written also was about energy as a one size, or no, it's an all size fits all.
Yeah, all the above, all the above.
Right?
I'm all about nuclear, wind, solar,
the reality
natural gas.
We need to reshore that stuff. Like, we need to have. So if we're going to win in artificial intelligence in space, and we're going to win artificial intelligence space and cyber, we need energy sources here. Artificial intelligence takes a tremendous amount because of the data center requirements. Our energy grid needs it as well, and that's a cyber threat. So, like, it's totally about bringing our playing field to a higher level and winning forward.
Yeah. Who are some of the leaders that you see in Washington on either party that you see are maybe stepping up, trying to move our country forward in a positive, proactive way?
It's sometimes really difficult to differentiate between the headline and the news and what you get to see when you're actually
the show horses versus the work horses.
And the show horses these days are so loud.
Right.
They're so loud showing, right? But I think that if I like him personally, so this is an issue. But like Congressman Pat Ryan, West Point graduate from Utica, New York, I think he's doing an exceptionally good job. Congressman Winder as well from Southern Virginia. They're both on the Defense Modernization Caucus, and I think they're just doing a really, really good job. The interesting thing about the Trump administration, which is what I dealt with the first time, is they really empower, or at least I've seen them empower, staff and directorate offices as well. So what they're doing with some of the civil agencies is pretty interesting, and I'm looking forward to seeing how your friend, I'm drawing a blank, the Secretary of the VA.
Oh, Doug Collins.
Yeah, Doug Collins. Yeah. I'm really interested to see how that work with our friend Daryl Owens there is going to start to reconsolidate dollars into veteran services, right? I'm really interested to see how the defense side is going to go as well. And I like what they're doing. It's just sometimes it's so distracting from some of the other things.
Yeah, you mentioned one of the West Point. One of my big fans is I love Senator Jack Reed, former 82nd Airborne Division.
Of course. Yeah.
Obviously on chair of the minority chair of Senate Armed Services Committee and also on the appropriation side. So, well, listen, we could chat here. We can get pumped about this. So, listen, thanks for joining us today. That's our show. Listen, subscribe, and review Warrior Money on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and wherever else you get your podcasts, or find us at Yahoo Finance. I'm Patrick Murphy.
And I'm Dan Kunze. We'll see you again next week.
This content was not intended to be financial advice and should not be used as a substitute for professional financial services.